Hello, and welcome back to this symposium on population and environmental change here at the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences, which is organized by the Environmental Committee of the Academy and by the Bayer Institute in the same institution. For you who are new to us, I say welcome, and for you who were here yesterday, welcome back. Yesterday, as today, we had a great lineup of speakers. Lei Wing-Yang went through the demography megatrends, including his two own editions, increasing education and shrinking household size. Karen Seto went through how urbanization is reshaping humanity's imprint on the planet, and how a lot of all the new city land is yet to be built, so therefore we have a chance of getting it right. Eric Lambert talked about population and land use from coupled to telecoupled systems. He went through some classical studies in the area and then talked about his own work in telecoupling linkages between countries concerning deforestation. And if you missed this yesterday, I have some good news, because you can see it in a recording that will be online on the Academy webpage very soon. So today we have two very interesting speakers as well, and we will end with a panel discussions with an international, no, sorry, not an international, but an interdisciplinary group of people. And our first speaker today, I'm very glad to introduce Laurie Hunter. She will talk about climate change and migration. Laurie Hunter is a professor of sociology at the University of Colorado Boulder, where she's also director of the CU Population Center. Her research focuses on human-environmental interactions with specific examinations of migration and climate change connections. She's a member of the National Academy of Sciences Board on Environmental Change and Society. So welcome, Laurie. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And thanks to everybody for being here. I'll go ahead and share my screen. I was going to say being here this early morning, but it's just early morning for me. I'm in Colorado.
Yes, yes.
Good afternoon, everyone. So again, thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. And I must say, I thoroughly enjoyed yesterday's presentations. I intersect with some of the speakers, but not all of the speakers regularly. And I learned quite a lot, and I enjoyed the questions as well. So I have been asked to provide an overview on migration and climate change. And I'll start out with a little disclaimer. I'm going to spend a little bit more time talking about the way that researchers that focus on this topic do our work. I want to do so in addition to the findings that characterize the state of knowledge now. I want to do so because this is a very politicized topic. I mean, we're hearing about this in the news right now, and we should be. But as a result, I think I really want to counter some of the alarmist narratives by diving into how we do our science and what it is that science is telling us. So I will cover these areas. First, provide a brief overview of migration, and then think about migration climate research, what motivated the research community. This work is actually fairly new. It's really emerged over the last 15 years or so. It emerged into a substantial body of literature, I must say. I'll talk about our approach, findings, and then think about some remaining puzzles and promising approaches. And again, I do so because I think this is a topic that's really urgent at the moment. And I will then conclude. So first off, an overview. So international migration. First off, let me say there's both international migration and internal migration. International migration being what it sounds like, right? Migration across national borders has dramatically increased over the past several years, actually tripled since 1970, up to the point now where 3.5% of the global population are international migrants. That's an astonishing number to me. 3.5% might not seem like a lot. But nearly 300 million individuals. And of course, that's not random, that movement. It's structured. There are, in a way, predictable flows. This is a map from the International Organization for Migration, which for those of you interested in more on this, have amazing volumes of descriptive information on migration patterns. These are receiving nations. So you can see there's some definite global patterns here. And there are global patterns when it comes to sending nations as well. In particular, India and China always top the list. The Pew Research Center put this sort of lens on it, which I thought was interesting. If all of the world's international migrants live in a single country, it would be the world's 5th largest with around 244 million people. They say 3.3, it's actually gone up since then. So this is a really substantial phenomenon, and obviously crossing international borders makes it a challenging one as well, because we've got both sending and receiving nations involved in this case. So I love this. This is a circle graph put out by some colleagues, I believe, of Wolfgang Lutz, who will be speaking next. This was in Science in 2014. Again, for those of you interested, it's easy to find on the web. They actually have a newer version of it, but this is based on census data, and it's a flow chart, just to give you a sense of the patterns of the international flows, because the historical patterns also shape where it is that individuals and households move if faced with climate pressures. So the way you read this, if you look at the large yellow bar up at the top, you see a flow of migrants moving from Latin America, where the yellow flow bumps up against that outer circle, moving to North America. So that's how you read this chart. So Europe is in green, and you can see Europe, and it's broken up into its constituent nations, receiving migrants from all sorts of different places. So Europe and North America being the primary receiving areas. So migration researchers, have studied the political, the economic, the social, the cultural dimensions of these migration flows. The environmental dimensions of these migration flows, as I mentioned, are something that's fairly newly been investigated. I say new, over the past couple of decades or so. And that's the body of work that I will emphasize here for you. So I mentioned that there's international migrants, but there's a lot more internal migrants. So internal migrants being those individuals who move within their country's boundaries, nearly 800 million. Now, I must give a caveat here in that it's pretty hard to get numbers when it comes to internal migration. You need to tap into census data from particular nations, for example, and of course there's variable quality in censuses. The definition of migration itself may differ across nations, but this is one of the best guesses that we have for now. And now that's migration. Migration can be voluntary, right? A voluntary movement. I also wanted to present some data on displacement. So displacements being movement that's forced. The Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, IDMC, is also a fabulous resource for anybody interested in learning more about patterns of displacement. They present these maps that include displacement from both conflict and disasters. And this is just for 2020. This is the latest data they have available. It's always amazing to me they can compile this so quickly. But this represents 55 million individuals. The blue circles are disasters. So you get a sense of the scale and the spatial distribution of where those displacements are occurring. And then this is a breakdown by particular kinds of hazards. And this is aggregated from 2008 forward. So you see the numbers of individuals. For example, on the far left, 156 million individuals displaced by floods, 119 by storms. This gives you a sense of the scope of what we're dealing with when we think about climate-related movement. Now, this is displacements. So one thing I'll get to to in just a second is all the different kinds of migrations. So displacements would be forced movement, but it doesn't necessarily mean that those individuals won't go back home. Right, so this can very much be temporary displacements, not permanent migrations. And that's something to think about when you bump into movement data. So there's a short overview. We've got the international migration and the internal migration. I wanted to move now to migration climate research and start with the research community's motivation. And I'll tell you that back in 1993, a fairly alarmist number was put forward with regard to climate refugees. And it wasn't just one individual, but Norman Myers is often credited with having that sort of alarmist approach. And what he did, one of my colleagues has talked about it as a back of the envelope calculation, sort of look at the places where individuals live that are vulnerable to climate, tally it up and say, oh, these people are going to have to move. Well, that's far too simplistic. And what I really want you to get from this presentation is that we know a lot more now about the kinds of things that, kinds of factors that shape migration and the ways in which climate will likely do so as well. Even the UN put out some forecasts about, with ideas of where we might see climate refugees in 2005, and they pulled them back because it just didn't pan out that way. This is tough stuff. And I think that the migration research community really stepped up to try to provide some empirical evidence about the ways in which this climate migration association might unfold. So I see that as part of a motivation. And I'll tell you now, pay attention to what you see in the media, because there are more and more stories saying, these alarmist numbers don't necessarily capture the picture. This is one that was just from December 2020 in an outlet called the Geographical. Predictions of mass migration due to climate change are rife, but not necessarily accurate. The Conversation very recently, in 2020, again, climate migration, what the research shows is very different from the alarmist headlines. And I thought this was so impressive. Even the Rolling Stone, are we thinking about climate migration all wrong? And they talk about the error of really buying into necessarily apocalyptic predictions, if you will. So we need to be careful about what we read. So let me move now to approach. And I mentioned that I wanted to talk a bit about the way that migration researchers do their work in order to understand the science that's coming out there and counter it to this popular alarmist narrative. So this is now 10 years old, which is amazing, but it remains a really useful framework for thinking about the ways in which migration decisions are made. And it was one of the first frameworks that really explicitly put environmental drivers or environmental factors into what we know about migration. So let's move first to the decision itself, right? So an individual or a household is making a decision whether to stay or whether to move. We know about all sorts of factors that influence that. There are political factors at the macro level, obviously national policies, something that we see is so important right now. Economic factors, so much of movement is a result of economic pulls or economic pushes if there are simply no opportunities in the origin areas. We also know that there are demographic factors, there are social factors. Social networks play a really key role in the decision to migrate. And what they did, Black and colleagues back in 2011, is they thought carefully about the ways in which environmental factors might also push migrants, but not just push migrants in a direct sense, but the ways in which, say, climate change and shifts in precipitation and temperature may influence those other kinds of drivers. Think about the ways in which climate change is reshaping the landscape of economic opportunity, for example. So those are macro forces that shape the decision to migrate. And then there's a whole bunch of research prior to integrating environmental dimensions into migration research that look at differences across age. There are very predictable patterns of migration by age, sex, education, wealth, marital status, and so on. And then at the meso level, we've got things like frameworks, cost of moving, social networks, and so on. So those are the factors that researchers sort of could think about when we model migration. And it's exciting, as I mentioned, to really add the environment in there. And I think so essential right now. I want to put forward some additional considerations that you have in mind when you bump into stories about climate refugees. Remember that we hear a lot about pushes, right? So climate as a push factor, economic opportunity or lack thereof as a push factor. But remember that there are also pulls, right? So individuals are drawn to particular places with particular characteristics. It's not all push. And a lot of times that sort of gets neglected, including even in the scholarship. We think about what pushes or results in migration, but not so much what are the factors on the other end that are bringing individuals to a place. So a few other things. We could think of oftentimes we think of entire households moving, right? It could be a nuclear family. A nuclear family decides that they're going to relocate for economic opportunities elsewhere. But there's also migration as a livelihood strategy. This may occur more often in the global south, where households facing some sort of stress may decide to send an individual to an urban space, right, to find labor and garner remittances to send back. So it's not just a household picking up and moving, but sometimes an individual within a household. And that's a different kind of migration and one we also need to consider. There are spatial dimensions to migration. How far does somebody go and how far does somebody need to go to be considered a migrant? There are temporal dimensions to migration. How long do they need to be gone to be considered a migrant? Some migration is permanent with no intention of coming back. Some migration is temporary. I mentioned the displacement data that we saw from the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center. You can see why it's sometimes really hard to find data across nations that are comparable, because all of these are pieces of a definition of migration. There's seasonal movement. I do work in rural South Africa where there's a lot of seasonal livelihood migration. And then there's voluntary dimensions to movement. And then there's the displacement, which we could think of as more forced. I want to add one more dimension there. So we think of migration as can be voluntary or involuntary, which is displacement. And another thing I'd like you to have in your head as you run into work on climate and migration is the fact that we think about individuals who've moved, but there are typically even more individuals that have not moved. So these non-migrants, right? And if we focus on what we need to do to protect the migrants themselves, we may be missing a whole bunch of people, in fact, far more people that have chosen to stay in place, even with climate pressures. And then there's a group of people who have voluntarily stayed in place in the face of climate pressures. So while it's important to think about those who've moved, we can't totally avert the gaze from those who have stayed, which are also a really important group of individuals or households. So that's a bunch of background. I want to move now to offer you 3 research examples, and then I will summarize what it is that we know. So the first one is a piece of my own with Fernando Villasmina and Rafael Naratsky. This was published a couple years ago in Population and Development Review. And we've done a lot of work on the migration from Mexico to the US. Fernando is an expert in that stream, not necessarily as related to environment, but just in general. And then Rafael and I have joined him to add this environmental dimension. Excuse me. So what we did was we took the 2000 and the 2010 census from Mexico, and we used that to measure Mexico-US migration within the 5 years prior. In many censuses, they ask, where did you live 5 years ago? So if those two things don't match, right, the census year and 5 years ago, somebody's a migrant. You don't know when it was that they moved specifically within that window, which is one of our challenges. We then merged temperature and precipitation data from the Climate Research Unit with that. And we used that to measure average temperature and precipitation and the ways in which that has changed across time. And then anomalies. Were there periods of particular dryness, periods of heavy rainfall, particularly hot spells? And from the census, we also had a suite of control variables. So individuals' ages, education, income, and so on, because you really want to control for all of that in order to identify an environmental signal, if you will. So above and beyond all these other things that we know influence migration, does the temperature or precipitation also help us understand migration patterns? That's the idea. We did find, excuse me, we did find that even controlling for those characteristics, when the environment was stressed, so high levels of temperature or low levels of rainfall, households were more likely to send a migrant to the US, but that was only the case in areas where there were really strong social networks already in the US. So there's an example of the real importance of those existing migration flows. Remember back to the circle chart, those existing migration flows very much will influence where it is that individuals and households go in the context of climate pressures. Another example, this was just recently published in the American Journal of Sociology. Barbara Entwistle led this team from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. This is in Thailand, in Nang Rong, a very small area, but an area in which they have collected data for a very long time, well over, probably coming up on 2 decades at this point. So they know a lot about the kinds of factors that influence migration. And what they did here was they used an agent-based model, or an ABM, to simulate, if you will, what future weather changes may do to existing migration patterns. So they know, again, age, education, all these other characteristics of individuals, and they know how those things relate to migration because of the long-standing work they've done in this area. So what they did was simulate future movement as related to different shifts in weather. This is just a graphic representation of an agent-based model. So this is a neat methodological approach to simulating future migration. So they bring in weather as an input, and what they did was predominantly use ongoing, they know the trend in weather, and they use that to create future weather scenarios in addition to climate projections. Weather impacts crop yield, which impacts assets, which impacts migration. Migration impacts the labor that's available to the household, which will then therefore impact yield, right? And there's remittances and other kind of plot characteristics. What they found was that these weather changes didn't really shift ongoing patterns of migration, out migration. But what it did was when weather was challenging, it made it much less likely that individuals would return to the origin. So that definitely has implications both for the receiving areas, right, that are hanging on to those migrants longer, and for the origin areas, which have lost labor. So a really interesting approach as well. The last example I'll give you is a qualitative one. This is from 2016, so a little bit older. Helen Adams did this work in Peru, and she used survey data, and she was especially interested in why people stay. So remember a few slides ago, I talked about, we emphasize migration, but there's also non-migration. There's even more people subject to climate pressures that don't move for whatever reason. So she was especially interested in these individuals that don't move. She integrated behavioral migration theory, so really detailed perspective on the decision-making process, and really engaged ideas around place satisfaction. And this is what she found. So she had this graphical representation of her results. Here's an individual deciding whether or not to migrate. If somebody's satisfied with their place of residence, there's no reason to migrate, right? They've got high levels of satisfaction. Let me say here too that she focused on highland areas of Peru that are already experiencing climate pressures and that have really strong histories of migration. So there are built-in social networks that individuals could tap into. Now, what this next underneath this black box shows us is that oftentimes when people don't move, we assume that they just don't want to or don't have the resources available to them, right? But it's much more complicated than that. So if someone's dissatisfied with their place of residence and they don't move, in fact, yes, perhaps they're trapped because they simply don't have the sufficient resources to migrate. But they also may actually have a positive attachment to place, even if they're dissatisfied with it. So, or dissatisfied with the current condition. This is something that we see a lot in the Pacific Islands, is that people don't want to move, even though they recognize that sea level rise is causing their islands to at some point be uninhabitable. They may be fearful or not interested in alternative locations, or they may have negative attachment to place. And what she means by that is obligations to individuals, households, relatives within that place that don't really, that keep them home, if you will. So what this shows is that when we see people who don't move, we really need to disaggregate it as well, because there's all sorts of different kinds of reasons that people don't move. So, and this was also just a couple of years ago, there have been case studies. I just gave you case studies, one from Mexico, one from Thailand, and one from Peru, case studies across the globe. But you really want to bring those together to see if there's any large scale lessons on migration and climate. And that's what Roman Hoffman and his colleagues did. They did meta-analysis, and I'm not going to go through this, but I want to give you a sense of what they did. They pulled out a whole bunch of these case studies that met particular criteria and looked at the environmental effect that was found by each one of these studies. So you've got a graph of that over on the right-hand side. The vertical line at the 0 represents basically no effect. And you'll see that most of these studies find a result that tends toward the right-hand side of the graph. That's a positive environmental effect, meaning that the environmental effect tends to increase the likelihood that an individual or a household will migrate. So a positive environmental effect from most of the studies. So then they pulled all of the studies together and disaggregated according to the type of environmental pressure. And this is what we see here. Again, the vertical line being no effect. And you see that all of these, the median value is the line within the rectangle, the median value. You see all of them having a positive effect. And over here on the left-hand side, the top one is the level of change in precipitation increases the likelihood of migration. Increase in temperature variability is the second one. Precipitation variability, a rapid onset disaster, and changes in the temperature level. So they aggregated a lot of studies and found in general a positive effect on migration. So indeed, these environmental changes pushing migrants. So let me summarize the state of the literature now as I see it. So I've really sort of pulled together findings from a lot of different studies. And in general, we find that in some areas, drier regions tend to exhibit higher levels of outmigration, and that would be evidenced by the meta-analysis that we just saw. Related, less natural capital, if you will, is sometimes associated with greater outmigration. By natural capital, what I mean here, and the way the term is used, is the resources that individuals tap into that perhaps are proximate to their household. So I do work in rural South Africa, where individuals rely very much on local grasslands and vegetation. So if the availability of that declines, you oftentimes see households or individuals moving. So again, this is consistent with the environmental stress increasing migration. It's really important to note that much of the environmentally induced migration is internal. So as opposed to the alarmist climate refugees and individuals or households crossing international boundaries, international migration is really hard. And so here we have lots of evidence that would suggest that most of this migration is internal. In fact, international migration is sometimes associated with higher levels of natural capital. So international migration, as I mentioned, is expensive. And so oftentimes it's not the poorest of the poor that are engaging in that kind of migration, but individuals with a bit more resources, a higher levels of resources available. And really important is that social capital matters a lot. And I mentioned that in, maybe I forgot to mention it in the migration work. No, I did. It was from areas that already had these social connections where migration was most likely to take place. And the same thing happened in the Thailand example as well. Environmental pressures come in all different forms and they intersect. One thing about current research is we tend to look at environmental push factors, so a drought, a flood, but what happens when all of these things come together to cause pressure? And that's something that we don't know a tremendous amount about. Environmental push factors intertwine with economic and other factors to shape vulnerability. And migration is only one of a variety of adaptive livelihood strategies. So, and I'll mention that in a few minutes about the additional work that we need to do. You know what? I forgot to start my clock. Could somebody tell me what the time is like?
Still have another few minutes if you wish to use them. So please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. 5 minutes or so?
Yeah, 3 to 5 minutes would be fine.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm so sorry I didn't start my clock.
That's no problem.
Okay, so I just wanted to mention too, if anybody's interested in these additional syntheses, there are several that have emerged in the past couple of years, so I'd be happy to provide citations. I also wanted to quickly mention a recent World Bank report where they did model internal climate migration, and I highly recommend that as a resource as well. They used the shared socioeconomic pathways, which Lewin Zhang mentioned yesterday, where they took these narratives, 5 different narratives of plausible futures, and they used very sophisticated modeling to think about what those narratives might mean for movement within countries. And it's a fascinating report, and I definitely encourage folks to take a look at that. So they were able to model projected internal migration and came up with these pretty high numbers as related to a climate impacted future as opposed to sort of just a business as usual future. I won't go through these key messages. I will move quickly to remaining puzzles and then promising approaches. So I think the research community still has work to do, especially given the policy importance of this. We do need to know a lot more about immobility. I've mentioned that a couple of times. There are a lot of socioeconomic differentials. For example, we don't know nearly enough about how climate pressures differentially impact men and women when it comes to migration. That's a really important area for future work. We have not done a great job thinking about thresholds. So, perhaps it's not just one flood that will push people, but perhaps after the third, that's when they'll move. There's a couple of studies on that, but we need a lot more. I mentioned migration is but one option in a livelihood portfolio. So households have at their disposal lots of different ways to adapt to environmental pressures, right? Different drought tolerant seeds, working with neighbors. So where does migration fit within that portfolio? Is it the first thing that households choose or the last? And that's important when it comes to supporting would-be migrants. And of course, we have a lot to do with regard to connections to policy questions. There's a lot of great methodological innovations. I love that the meta-analyses are showing up. There's some fantastic extensions to theory. These new methodologies, ABMs aren't new, the agent-based models aren't new, but I love to see them applied to this question. Qualitative work, actually talking to people about their preferences and their migration intentions is so useful. And then these informed projections like the World Bank has done. We need to do much more integrating our work into international policy. So I'll just conclude by hoping that what I've left you with is that migration and climate connections are so much more than this alarmist sort of climate refugee narrative that we hear, and that by thinking about all of the different factors that shape migration, thinking about the ways that we model it and come to understand it, will help you, will help all of us really think more deeply about this connection between migration and environment. And while most work is showing that there's a positive effect, as you see in this meta-analysis, we really need to think about the nuance here before we jump into alarmist informed policy, basically. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Laurie Hunter, for this fascinating talk about the connections between environmental change and migration. And there's, of course, a lot of questions now coming up.
Good. I haven't been keeping track of anything in the Q&A.
No, and I forgot to say in the beginning that please, everyone who's in on the Zoom, because it's also live streamed this event, but if you're on Zoom, there's a Q&A function that we very much welcome you to use, so you can all be part of the discussion. One question that popped up for me by the end of your talk was all these people who are staying, as you were saying, now after the latest big migration flows from Syria, for example, and other places in Africa. Many countries in Europe and also the US have put in stricter immigration laws. And how is this affecting the people that chooses to stay? I mean, or chooses to go or stay? And should we talk more about how to help people to migrate?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Yeah, no, that's so important. And that is obviously I think that's really a topic of the day, right? I mean, you've probably seen the horrific images of the Haitian migrants at the US border. And certainly we hear a lot about climate-related migration. And I'll tell you, the policy arena is a really tough one. It's not an area in which I've worked, but even President Biden back in February put forward an executive order asking his security department to think about climate-related refugees and how do we best support them. And certainly that's the case the world over. There's lots of different pieces to that question. One is, and the one that I think has been the real sticky wicket across all countries, is how do we identify climate related movement when climate is bundled into all of these other things, right? So individuals or households may move as related to a climate push, but perhaps they were already so impoverished, right? And we're unable to, how do we identify somebody who's climate move versus economic move? How do we disentangle those? Because they're so tangled up together. And what is necessary to identify someone as a climate related migrant or a refugee in order to qualify for refugee protection? Right. And so disentangling that has proven just so challenging. And then, so that's one thing, is how do we identify that dimension of refugee movements? And that has really, I think, kept so many people from being able to be helped. And the second piece I wanted to mention is the presumption that people want to move. So New Zealand was very proactive in trying to create a refugee status for individuals who were moving from the Pacific Islands because of climate-related pressures. people don't want to move. So I mentioned, right, that these islands, I mean, these are the homes of their ancestors, right? So yeah, being a refugee for them, the research shows for many of them is a category of last resort. Instead, help us stay home, right? So to not just responding to individuals presuming that they're going to be or want to be helped in with a refugee status, but helping individuals adapt such that they can stay home is another piece of this policy puzzle. Just a couple of things. There's a whole bunch there. But
of course. Yeah, thanks. And related to that, there was a study by Adger et al. In One Earth recently that talked about that there's so much more potential in authorities helping people to migrate temporarily within the country or regionally, and then helping them to move back. So like a controlled migration, and also yeah. So
absolutely. No, and the World Bank report, for anybody interested in this, I would suggest too, one of the points that I didn't go through was, climate migration is likely an inevitability, but it need not be a crisis, right? So exactly that, supporting migrants, be it through temporary relocation, adaptation within their places of origin, skill training that will allow people to shift livelihoods or create different kinds of livelihood strategies that are less climate dependent, right? So there's the issue is that we need to thoughtfully prepare for this now. We need to thoughtfully prepare for this a decade plus ago, right? But the time is now, and that we need not think of as Adger says, we need not think of this as a crisis, but we do need to respond thoughtfully.
Thanks. Time to get some questions from the audience in. And there's one, could you say a bit more about the studies that consider threshold for migration? What type of thresholds are they looking at, and what is their finding?
Yeah, absolutely. So the one I'm most familiar with is one I was a part of. It was actually one of the Mexico-US pieces where we looked at, again, temperature and precipitation. So what I've seen people do, and in this study, imagine that there's ours was a drought. Individuals or households tend not to send migrants in the drought year or even the year after, but 2 years hence. So there's a threshold, right? So we can't necessarily assume something like that happens and people move, because that's a really stressful time. Instead, it might take a year or two for households or individuals to garner the resources to move. So that's one kind of threshold. And then other work has looked at, maybe it's not the first flood, but then there's another flood 2 years ago or 2 years hence. And then there's another one, right? And so it might be that third one that ends up pushing individuals. And so there is some work on that talks about the cumulative climate effect. And, there'll be different findings in different parts of the globe, which is part of the hard thing. It's so context dependent, but the idea being that it's not necessarily the first that's going to push migrants. So if we do a study and we look at only one event and we don't see migration, that doesn't necessarily mean that there isn't any, but maybe it hasn't happened yet, right? So that's the thing to keep in mind there, that these pressures accumulate over time.
So more studies are needed.
Yeah, I hate to have to say that, but we have done there's very little of that work. Part of it is, and it sounds like a cop-out, but data is very hard to come by. So I mentioned the census data project that I did, right? So if somebody moved within a 5-year window. So if you want to understand if they moved as related to a particular environmental pressure, how do you link that movement with that pressure if you don't know within the 5-year window when somebody moved, right? So in order to really do this work well, you need to know when somebody moved, where they moved from. It'd be great to know where they moved to in order to really link the environmental data in a precise way. So sort of the availability of really detailed migration data has certainly held back some of the work that needs to be done. And then, as you're saying, if you want to do cumulative pressures, then you need migration data and the timing of the migration over a long period of time. And that information is really hard to come by, which is what's held back a lot of this work.
Right. Yes, of course, there's many difficulties when studying this issue. And the next question is touching upon something that you just mentioned briefly in the end of your talk. It's gender issues in connection with this. And what are the implications of gendered institutions in communities of origin for patterns of migration in response to climate change?
So important. And again, we don't have nearly as much information on this as we should. The work I'm familiar with has identified sort of intensified pressure on women in the places of origin, because where patterns of migration tend to be male dominated. So a climate pressure or cumulative climate pressures, right, impact households and communities. It might intensify male out migration, which means more and more women are left alone with households at home. So intensifying pressure on those women to manage the household day by day. There are a couple of studies that suggest that that dynamic actually empowers women in the sense that then they're receiving remittances and have more control over financial management of the household. But most of the work, and I have to say there's not a lot of work, suggests that the pressure intensifies on women and makes it harder for them. So there's your gendered institutions, right, in the origin communities. If you have a pattern whereby men are typically the one to migrate, they're leaving the women at home.
Thank you. And moving focus again here. There's a question on related to a study from 2020 by Xu, Kohler, Lenton, and co-authors in PNAS, which claims that as far back as 6,000 years ago, humans were concentrating roughly at the same subset of globally available temperature conditions, which is a mean annual temperature of between 11 to 15 centigrades. Depending on scenarios of population growth and warming, they argue that over the next 50 years, 1 to 3.5 billion people will be living in places with a mean average temperature of 29 degrees found today in the Saharan desert, basically. In what ways do the predictions that you make account for favorable? In what ways do the predictions that you make account for favorable ecological conditions for humans, and how does your work differ from their study? I think, I hope you got my question.
It's sort of cracking up in my headphones as well, but I think I get the idea. And I mean, one thing that, well, first, I really shy away from predictions and projections. I think that it's just so challenging to set the parameters of some hypothetical future, right? And that's why I actually really like this shared socioeconomic pathways that have been mentioned a couple of times, including by me. But those are, 5 different scenarios of plausible futures. So they look at population size, levels of education, which we'll hear a lot more from Wolfgang, cultural values sort of that shape consumption, gender roles, they're plausible futures. So futures where the world tends to be highly unequal and that there's a real dichotomy of haves and have-nots, a world in which things are much more egalitarian. So these are different futures, and using the parameters that characterize these plausible futures, they can then make projections, right? Because extrapolating from what we know now about the association between social economic processes and migration just doesn't really work, because we don't know what that future looks like, right? What we've got that wasn't in the article is air conditioning, what we've got that, we've got technology that shapes the spatial distribution of population right now in ways that, in ancient history did not happen. So even taking now and thinking about what it means, 50 years from now doesn't work because we just don't know what that world looks like.
I'm sorry, but I wasn't clear enough, but it's actually that the same conditions, favorable condition, has been where people have concentrated from 6,000 years ago to now. So actually the whole of this period.
Okay, so I don't think I understand the question and I'm really sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry. No, it's more if you take these scenarios into account of a scenario where there's such a big environmental change, not just the minor catastrophes or the major catastrophes here and there, but actual a completely different climate in many parts of the world.
Right. And again, I think that would be the kind of projection, and part of the problem is that you can't just think about climate, you have to think about the socioeconomic context that's interacting with that climate, right? So an inhospitable, I would say that Las Vegas presents an inhospitable climate, but it's technology that has allowed for the most rapidly growing city in America to be there, right? So it's really not just the climate and whether it's hospitable or not hospitable, but how does that climate intersect with the technology and the socioeconomic conditions that shape human presence in that environment.
Thanks so much. Sorry for the confusion.
I'm sorry.
I was just seeing if there was one more. Yes, it's one from Eric Lamb. And for households under environmental pressures who decide not to migrate, do we know what other actions they preferentially adopt? Are these primarily demographic, technological, or behavioral?
So I'm so sorry, you're cracking up a little bit for me. That do we know what?
Do we know what other actions they preferentially adopt? Are these primarily demographic, technological, or behavioral?
That's great. Yeah, thank you. At least the work that I'm familiar with, the measures tend to be adaptations with regard to the environment itself. So technological adaptations that would allow individuals to stay in place, but then also economic adaptations. So different support for different kinds of livelihoods, livelihoods that might be less climate sensitive. And again, Eric, in that World Bank report, there's more specifics with regard to the kinds of responses that have been tried and that people tend to prefer. Again, this is an area where we need a lot more work. Most of the work in this has been done in the Pacific Islands. So we need a much broader swath, but technological adaptations allowing individuals to stay in place, and then economic adaptations allowing for livelihoods that are less climate sensitive.
Excellent. Thank you so much. These were all the questions we had time for this time.
Okay.
Tomorrow we'll pop into the panel discussion, no doubt. We will take a short break now and see you back here at top of the hour.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Welcome back from the break. Our next speaker is Wolfgang Lutz. He's a professor at the University of Vienna and head of its newly established Department of Demography. He's also founding director of the Wittgenstein Center for Demography and Global Human Capital, and a senior advisor at ISA. And only last week, his book, Advanced Introduction to Demography, came out, which includes many of the issues that he will be integrating in his talk. Warmly welcome, Wolfgang Lutz.
Thank you very much for inviting me. This is a very important symposium, and I'll try in my presentation now to sort of come back to the bigger picture. And let me just try to share my screen here. I hope you can see it. Yes. And So it's entitled Population and Human Capital Scenarios for the 21st Century in the Context of Environmental Change. And I will start with a bit of history, because this is certainly not a new topic, population and environmental change. There was a wave of studies in the 1990s. There were big efforts funded also by the MacArthur Foundation with many case studies, many publications coming out. And exactly 20 years ago, with Landis McKellar and Brian O'Neill, I've written the book on population and climate change to try to summarize the state of the art, what we knew at that point. And as I put here on the right, I mean, some of the basic facts about climate change, as also about the population trends, really have not changed fundamentally since then. What has changed is the greater public awareness and the sense of urgency that we now have in the field of climate change. I should also say a word about the politics on the international stage. We, in 2001, had a big global science panel organized by my institute, as well as the IUSSP, which is the International Union of Demographers, and the United Nations University. And we were fortunate to have the highest possible patronage, namely Maurice Strong, who was Mr. Environment in the UN system. You may know that he was behind the Stockholm 1970 Environment Conference. He was chairing the 92 Rio Earth Summit and really had been the most influential international figure in this field. And then Nafis Sadik, who has been the long-term head of the United Nations Population Fund. So these are sort of really the most important key figures on population and environment in the UN system. So this, we had many deliberations and produced a consensus statement of this interdisciplinary group of scientists that was published in Nature and Population and Development Review under the strong topic, population should be on the Johannesburg agenda. Well, the Johannesburg 2010 World Summit on Sustainable Development was the follow-up to the Rio 92 summit. And there were good reasons that we thought that indeed population needs to be prominently there. We said if we do not put the human population at the core of the Sustainable Development Agenda, our efforts to improve human well-being and preserve the quality of the environment will fail. So this is a pretty clear statement. This statement is also remarkable because it opened up some research directions for future work. It says in the last sentence, hence in Johannesburg, consideration of sustainable development policies must include population growth, distribution, mobility, including migration, which I just heard about, and then this notion of differential vulnerability was introduced here, and as well as the empowerment of people and especially women. Well, it was scheduled to be on the agenda, and many European countries brought it forward to the main discussion floor to talk about population. And then all of a sudden it disappeared. And when I asked one of the ambassadors later on what had happened to the topic of population, said, well, you know, we were already fighting with the Americans over climate change. We did not want to enter another fight over abortion. So this is typically when people start talking about population, what most of people just immediately think abortion, a highly controversial topic. So it's removed from the agenda. It's not being openly discussed. And at the end of my talk, I will come back. What is the situation today in the context of the Sustainable Development Goals? Okay, here is a chart from a paper together with Raya Mutarak on population and climate change, how to conceptualize it. It's what we've been discussing over this whole symposium. Of course, it's us, the human population, through our consumption, energy consumption in particular, cause the greenhouse gases and cause global climate to change. But it's also us who come up with new technologies, cleaner, greener technologies that may help to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So this is what we usually call the mitigation side, like human activities as well as technological change, trying to reduce global climate change. And then on the right-hand side, we have how climate change affects the human population, and that's the main reason why we are concerned of how it may affect human well-being. So through this changes in temperature, humidity, extreme events, sea level rise, and so on, it can directly affect our health and mortality, which affects the population size and structure. But it can also affect livelihood. There may be some adaptation that then will result also in migration, as we've just heard in the previous presentation by Laurie. So what is here, if you see these red arrows, that sort of introduces the demographic differential vulnerability. Not everybody is equally vulnerable. This is at the individual level by age and by gender, and it's by level of education of the household. And sort of this has been really given rise to a series of new approach about differential vulnerability, because this also matters for the policy priorities. How can we help to reduce the vulnerability? Now let's zoom into this lower box, and I want to give your attention to the T, the red letters there, because our mitigation happens today and in the near future, let's say time T. But when climate change, it's already changing, but it is likely to get stronger and more severe in the future. So the climate of the future will not meet the population of today, but it will meet the population of the future, T plus X. And as you see also these age pyramids, and here we have already added color, education can be quite different. So this is why we really need an explicit focus on forecasting, even through very wide ranges of scenarios, but we simply cannot avoid to deal with forecasting, because we know for sure that the population of the future is not going to be identical to the population of today. By the way, this is the case with any policy making, even in social policy or economic policies. When we have the data from the past years, we cannot automatically assume that when these new policies are implemented a few years in the future, that they will meet exactly the same conditions, exactly the same population. And some issues like population aging, we know for sure that populations are changing and how they will be changing. Okay, so we need to understand that the climate change will affect the future. Climate change will affect the population of the future, and not, as is often assumed in many studies, today's population with today's public health capabilities, today's economic structure. I mean, I've seen so many studies, including from the World Health Organization, estimates how many malaria deaths there will be in East Africa due to climate change. And what they do, they have a climate forecast, let's say for 2060 or 2070, and then match it with today's populations and today's proportion of subsistence farmers and so on. But likely this is going to change. There are going to be likely many fewer subsistence farmers in Eastern Africa in 50, 60 years. So for doing so, we need to forecast the human population, and we need to forecast human characteristics that are not just the conventional age and sex that are typically part of most population projections, but we need additional human characteristics that can be forecast because they are stable. And here education is a prime candidate. We introduced this and under the notion of the demographic metabolism model that's I'm going to be explaining in a minute. So it says this tightly of forecasting societies and captive capacities through a demographic metabolism model, because in seeking to understand how future societies will be affected by climate change, we cannot simply assume they will be identical to those of today, because climate and societies are both dynamic. Just repeating what I just said, but it's such an important point that I think it needs to be repeated. So this demographic metabolism, the notion has been introduced by the American demographer Norman Ryder already in an influential article in 1965 on the cohort approach, but it hasn't been really picked up. It was myself in 2013 that combined this with the powerful tools of multidimensional, something called multi-state population dynamics to forecast social change. So we're looking at certain individual characteristics that are formed at young age and then are stable over the life course. And as the new cohorts who are different with respect to these characteristics replace the old ones by moving up the age pyramid, that's how societies changed. By the way, this was already introduced by a sociologist, Mannheim. He called it generation change. And Ryder wrote quite a bit of this about this, but he did not operationalize it in a quantitative way. In this context, it's also important in demography that we distinguish between different effects. So that what I've just talked about is the cohort effects, characteristics that stay invariant after a certain age for individuals, but that may change from one cohort to the next. So there's a change in composition of the population, and Ryder really believed that this is the only force of change. He thought that people are unlikely to change over their life course and their deep opinions or whatever. It's only the new generations coming that will bring change to society. But then, of course, there are age effects. We are changing as we get older. I mean, our hair getting gray is a typical age effect that affects everybody. And then there are period effects. These are external changes affecting all cohorts at the same time, such as big crisis event, pandemics like we have now, or new technologies that affect all the cohorts. And these clearly are the most difficult to predict. And when people sometimes say that the future cannot be predicted, what they mean is these these period effects. But as I will now show with respect to demographic-based cohort change, we do have a pretty good basis for projecting. Here you see the age pyramids for the Republic of Korea. You always know by the age pyramid, women to the right, men to the left, and then sorted by age groups. And we here added a third dimension, namely education. The gray area means people below the age of 15, where they are just still in education. And then red means never been to school, no formal education at all. And we can have 6 categories. I here reduced it just to 4, where we have some primary education, secondary, and then post-secondary or tertiary education. Now, the Republic of Korea has once seen one of the world's most rapid education expansion, together with Singapore, which I also will show in a minute. You see here in 1970, the women, in particular above the age of 40, were essentially all uneducated. They had never the opportunity to get any formal education, because in the 40s and 50s, Korea really was a very poor developing country. But then they had already started to educate the younger ones. And then if we jump 20 years to 1990, this cohort that is highlighted here is 20 years older. Here you see some improvements in education because of they are only 15 to 19-year-olds, so some of them still complete secondary education, and some of them have the dark blue, the tertiary education. But then for the next 20 years, they will be 20 years older, but maintain their educational composition, because very little additional education happens. So the only thing you have to calculate here is mortality that's differential by education and migration, but this is a minor effect. And then yet another 20 years later in 2030, they are already people above the age of 70, but we know, so if we know today how many women, let's say at the age of 20, have completed high school education, we have a very good analytical starting point to say how many 70-year-old women there will be 50 years into the future with completed secondary education. And with education being so important for health, as I will just show in many other things, this is very strong predictive power for a social science. So why do we want to add education to age and sex in population analysis? First of all, I think it's fair to say that education is the most important source of observable population heterogeneity after age and sex. And this matters. Well, first of all, because it matters for the demographic trends themselves, because during demographic transition, more educated women have fewer children, have lower child mortality, and more educated adults live longer. So I've coined this notion about the cognition-driven demographic transition, and if we have time, we can talk a little more about this. So the changing education composition of the population also changes the population forecasts themselves in terms of population size and age structure. But then there is a specific interest in education for its own right, because education is a crucial determinant of individual empowerment and human capital. It is a key driver of socioeconomic development, public health, economic growth, quality of institutions and democracy, and as I will also highlight now, adaptive capacity to climate change. Now let's go to Singapore. When I first came to this country in 1985, I saw a divided country. When I walked through the main streets, this was like in Europe, highly educated people, highly technical. They all used already some sort of electronic equipment, and they were really sort of modern, well-educated young people. And then when I went around the corner, I found myself, let's say, in rural China, lots of uneducated people who couldn't speak any English, looked very poor, ate their traditional Chinese food. And you see this by the black line. These are sort of the elderly people who had never the opportunity to go to school, because in Singapore, again, the education expansion was very, very recent. So in any society, sociologists would typically say, well, this is a class differentiate. There are just two different classes. Well, but these are not self-reproducing classes as we typically study in sociology, but they are cohort-based classes, because the young people have been educated, they became different. So if we go back to 1950 in Singapore, you see there, I mean, 80%, 90% of the women had never been to school. And then already in 1960, you see it's been improved. It's still a very young population, very high fertility. In 1960, I'm sorry, the colors changed a bit now, because we only recently sort of added the back projection to 1950. So here we see that in 70 now there is a young population slowly getting educated. Now we go on every 10 years. You see now, this is the time when Singapore had its major economic growth, when these better educated young cohorts came into the main working ages, taking over important functions in the companies and in government. So we did also a lot of analysis of the returns of these educational expansion on economic growth, and it's a very strong relationship. And then fertility declines because women are better educated and having fewer children, and Singapore is getting older, but the young cohorts are so much better educated. So today they have the highest proportion of people with post-secondary or tertiary education in the younger cohorts in the entire world. Now let's go back to health, because this is clearly we are concerned about the pandemic, and not only about fertility, but really sort of health and mortality is a main topic of development and progress and quality of life. They talk about the drivers of life expectancy increases has really been dominated by this Preston curve. Preston is a demographer at the University of Pennsylvania, and had the opportunity to do my graduate studies with him in Philadelphia. This was already published in 1975, shows the relationship between per capita income on the x-axis and life expectancy during the 1900s, the 1930s, and the 1960s. So what he found is an association that at the beginning at low income is very steep, and then it flattens off. So more income doesn't buy you much more life expectancy after a certain level is reached. And also you see that the curve is shifting upwards. This is being interpreted as medical progress, so that the same income now buys you more years of life expectancy because we have better medical technologies. Well, if we do it now, we recently published this update for the 1970s, 80s, and 2010s. And with respect to per capita income, we see exactly a continuation of the same Preston pattern here, the curve flattening with higher income and moving upward over time. But look what happens when we replace the GDP per capita with the mean years of schooling of the population. Wow, it becomes almost a straight line, meaning that there is no saturation. So even at high levels of education, more education can buy you more life expectancy. And there was very little shift, almost no shift over time of this curve, which means that really there is little residual to be explained. And we did complicated statistical models in this to show that indeed the education is the key driver. And this is a major problem of social sciences, the endogeneity, and this has been discussed in this paper extensively. Like income and health, of course, mutually influences others, and so does educational attainment. But here, just for the causal nature of the analysis, it is really helpful that the schooling happens typically decades before then the adult educational attainment has consequences both on health or on income, because there the schooling many decades ago is not endogenous. So this time lag, so to say, between going to school and then having better educated adults that have all these positive behavioral changes, that really helps us to sort out the causalities quite clearly. So this led us to this headline summarizing a study: when it comes to survival, mind matters more than money. Fertility, so much has been written. I just want to show you this empirical graph here, where we have all the demographic and health surveys for 58 countries plotted. So the country is ranked on the x-axis by its average level of fertility, and then we have the different education groups within each country, and you see very consistently red, the uneducated women in each country have by far the highest level of fertility. And then even here, 6 categories is almost linearly ranked with the highest educated women having the lowest. So there's a very strong empirical association. And there is indeed a good reason to assume that we talk here about what I call functional causality from education to health, fertility, and behavior. What do I mean by functional causality? Well, I think in social sciences, we can't aim for the same sort of causality that we have in the natural sciences, but it means for the countries we want to talk about and for the foreseeable future, it makes sense to assume that this is a causal relationship. And we can even conclude that education is not just a proxy for socioeconomic status. That is what sort of typically standard practice in social sciences. We break down the level of education as a proxy for SES. I think there's reason to assume that it leads to real cognitive change in our minds, and not to say in our brains. There is Eric Kandel, who got the Nobel Prize in medicine for his path-breaking work on memory and the brains. And I had the opportunity doing several seminars with him. And he very clearly points out that every learning experience builds new synapses in our brains and makes us physically different. And he often says, like, let's repeat this now for a third time. That when you walk out through this door, you're physically a different person than when you entered, and you will be so for the rest of your life. So what does education do? It enhances our cognitive skills. And this brings us also back to the famous 3 preconditions for a lasting fertility decline of Ansley Cole of Princeton, that said fertility needs to be within the calculus of conscious choice. So we need to sort of have a rational approach and not just have as many children as God gives us. It changes risky behavior to less risky behavior. It tends to extend our personal planning horizon, and we are faster in learning from past damage. So these are all well-documented consequences of more education and the cognitive change that comes along, that all matter directly also for the adaptive capacity to climate change. And of course, we have better access to relevant information and typically also higher incomes. So this brings us now back to what Lev and John yesterday told us about the socioeconomic challenges for adaptation and mitigation, because these 3 SSBs, as they've now been defined, and what we call sort of the human core of these shared socioeconomic pathways, are population scenarios by age, sex, and level of education. Here you see for the world as a whole, the most recent assessment. We are sort of updating them every 5 years with new baseline data. And you see the SSP2, that's sort of the middle of the road, if you want, the medium and most likely. Also, we don't use this terminology. Because in every country in the world, essentially the younger ones are better educated than the older ones. There's a lot of momentum already in educational improvement. And you see under this scenario, the population will level off shy of 10 billion during the second half of the century, and then start a moderate decline, but it's going to be a much better educated population during the second half. But this is not guaranteed. You have the SSP3, which is sort of also the stalled development, higher inequalities. And there you see not much further improvement in the educational structure, despite of the fact that today in most countries, the younger ones are already better educated. but population growth, particularly in the highly growing countries of Africa, sort of eats this up. Sort of if the school expansion cannot keep pace with the population growth, then they're actually the red area, the people without any schooling increases to some extent. And then, of course, if we have a very rapid, very optimistic scenario that most of the countries in the world now do what Singapore or South Korea have successfully done, then we could potentially see a much earlier peak in population size with a much better educated population at the end of the century. Now, I've just last week given a keynote in India. I just wanted to show India is actually in a couple of years going to be the world's largest country. And this is also quite amazing. Look, India in 1950 women were more than 90% completely uneducated, never had a chance to go to school. On the male side, you had some improvements. And then this is now India 1970, a little further improvement, but it's a divided society by caste system and others. And you always see women much worse educated than men. Population increasing already to more than 500 million in 1970, then 1990, still not much of a visible change. But then after 2000, you see now the Indian government has really made major efforts to educate the young women. And this you see reflected here. So for the next decades, we can assume these better educated women, as they move up the age pyramid, will also bring some of the positive consequences of population change. And here we just see the different scenarios. This is the medium scenario for India, already soon surpassing China, as I said, in population size. The rapid development scenario will still go up to almost 1.5 billion people. But look at the stalled development scenario that will bring India to more than 2 billion people. And some further improvements in education still, because that's embedded into their structure already, but not that much. There are other countries, and I don't have time. We have these now for all countries in the world on our Wittgenstein Center Data Explorer. Nigeria, it's just amazing how it's on the crossroads now. If it went for the SSP, one really massive investments in schooling like they did in South Korea, it could still level off before 400 million people and having the second half almost a European level education. But if it more stalled development, then it could go up to almost 1 billion people by the end of the century, and actually an expansion of the uneducated. And this will bring, of course, lots of problems with adaptation, among other things. Now, talking about adaptation, this journal coming out of Stockholm, Ecology and Society, where we had a special edition on how education matters for the vulnerability to natural disasters. And unfortunately, I'm running out of time and we cannot go in details, but it's before the disaster, during the disaster, and after the disaster. Really, education helps you to be better prepared, to get better through the disaster, and to recover better after the disaster. And we then translated these SSPs into an exercise, how many sort of additional million of climate change related death this may bring on the basis of different SSPs. So you see here the red lines on the right, they refer to SSP1, the very rapid development. And you see the different red lines show different degrees of climate hazard. So the one is a 10% higher to the baseline, the other is 20% higher to the baseline. But you see, if people are developing as rapidly and as well educated as assumed under SSP1, there may even be a decline in the death due to catastrophic events. This is mostly natural disasters here. But under the SSP3, you see there's going to be a major increase. And here, the degree of climate change matters much more strongly. So if we have a 20% higher climate hazard as it's measured here, then this may lead to an increase by 3 or 4 of the deaths due to natural disasters. It's just an illustration to what I initially said. There can be different social futures, and they matter greatly depending. It's not only the future climate change that matters, but the future society that is being met by this. And sort of science gave to this article a subtitle that Also had me some angry engineers calling up saying that fund more educators rather than just engineers, because at the moment, these huge sums of $1 billion per year pledged under the Green Climate Fund, well, they haven't come up to what they promised yet, but still there's significant money. It mostly goes into sort of concrete engineering project instead of what I think would also make sense, empowering people to then be better prepared. Now, so in the last, and that my time is soon over, I'm going to focus again on what the policy agenda today. We have this 17 Sustainable Development Goals, and particularly goals 3 and 4 are very relevant for population. And in goal 3, there are specific targets on reproductive health also. And then in goal 4, they have universal primary and secondary education of high quality for all girls and boys. Now, we have made an effort to translate the SDGs into the population outlook. So here you see different population projections. You see on top the green area, that is sort of the range, the 80 or 95% range of the UN population projections. And then the 3 solid lines give you the SSPs, which the SSP2 being a little lower than the UN projections for reasons that we can discuss later. But what you see is the SDG scenarios, and they have an area because there are different ways how to implement the education goals. So what we did there is assume there is sort of a turbo in development, a booster between 2015 and 2030, because that's what the SDGs are covering, that then will have lasting consequences of population size, bringing it below the medium. The red line, the SSP1, in a way is based on assumptions that this booster is kept on throughout the rest of the century. It's not just a 15-year goal period, but throughout the century that will result in lower population size. And I'm going to conclude with this. I happen to be involved as one of 15 experts asked by the UN Secretary General to produce the Global Sustainable Development Report 2015, which was the first. They have every 4 years such an external report about the progress of the Sustainable Development Goals. And we had in this group a long discussion of how to deal with population. We even had identified population as sort of some of the missed topics that need to be added to the SDG agenda in the next update. And I think that this is also some of the reasoning why the Swedish Academy has called for this meeting, that there is indeed an urgent need to address the population issue. But in the end, what I just showed you, this graph, that the goals that are already explicitly on health and on education in the SDGs actually sort of do the trick. If they are fully implemented, they will bring down population growth and empower women enough to freely choose the family size they want to have, which will result in lower fertility also in the least developed countries. So at the end, this group felt there was no need to sort of make another effort to bring population prominently onto the sustainable development agenda. Okay, I'll stop here. And it was just said initially that last week a new textbook has come out that really tries to synthesize and put into context some of the things that I've told you. And if you want more information, you can find it there. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for your talk. And now we have some questions to follow. And one of them is, well, there's several questions on the same issue, that education, you've talked a lot about the education and what it means for demography and population size, but can you tell us more about the implication for environmental change and also for how people in the future will be, how much education will influence the ability of people in the future to deal with climate change?
Yeah, I mean, that is, education matters both for the mitigation side as well as for the adaptation side. And already yesterday, after Levin's presentation, there were quite some discussions about how it matters for the mitigation. that education typically increases the income, and there have been also our new education reconstructions have been used to once again show through economic growth regressions the overriding importance of universal primary and at least junior secondary education for poor countries to come out of poverty. This was already prominently published in 2008 and was possibly one of the reasons also these, of course, our studies were not the only ones showing this, that now by the Millennium Development Goals, they focused only on universal primary education. And we showed this is not enough. We need also broad-based secondary education. And now the SDGs have universal primary and secondary education. And I should add at high quality, because we did some other studies recently about quality adjusted education or skills adjusted based on some reading skills tests and so on. And indeed, there is the unfortunate situation that some of the developing countries that have rapidly expanding their primary education system, the quality has actually been declining. So the skills gaps has further widened. But to come back, of course, for mitigation, it was said, and we had discussed this yesterday, that it leads to higher income. And if higher income leads to more consumption, then of course it's associated with higher greenhouse gas emissions. But if you don't want this effect of higher income, I said there is an easy way to get rid of this unwanted effect and just tax the additional income away. Then you still have the other benefits of better health, better institutions, a better empowerment, but you don't have people spending more money on energy. And then, of course, another thing is for the mitigation side that we may be discussing in the panel, that now the challenge really is to get to zero emissions within 20 or 30 years maximum. So much of the population growth, because of the great momentum, we'll see the differences between different fertility rates and also different education in the second half of the century. So that would not help us with really sort of meeting the zero emissions targets in the nearer future. Now, with respect to adaptation, as I tried to show you with the different calculations, there is indeed a major reason to assume that some already unavoidable climate change will be much less dangerous for populations, for societies that are better prepared through all kinds of measures, public health facilities, and so on. But a basis for this better preparedness is indeed a better educational attainment distribution.
Yes, there might be some question about the easy solution of putting tax on carbon. We haven't seen with the higher education, you can't really say that we have seen a lot of this taxes yet, but maybe it will come. And maybe Thomas Sterner have something to say about that in the discussion as well.
I should add, maybe there is also some studies that at a given level of education, sorry, at a given level of income, if you take the same income groups, then the more educated tend to be more flexible in their mind to use to greener technologies, to use more public transportation. Sort of, if you have low educated people with high income, they do even more stupid things with their money than the more educated people.
Well, that's hopeful. So there's another question here about the years of good life indicator. I haven't really spoken about that. Someone that's from.
Yes, well, that is another big project of mine that I didn't have time to talk about. It is that in sustainability science, we have typically sort of a well-being function where you have W, sort of the human well-being on the left-hand side, being explained by a function of different capitals. And following also the important work of Partha Dasgupta in this field, that sort of the inclusive wealth, which has not only the material capital and the human capital, but also the natural capital. And these capitals, together with institutions and knowledge and sciences, help to produce a human well-being. Now, when we try to quantitatively address this issue in some modeling, we also need to have a quantitative indicator of the W, of the human well-being. So this has been my current ERC project, where for the last years we've been trying to find out, following certain criteria that are desirable for such an indicator of well-being. We came up with this indicator, years of good life, which is the question, how long are people alive on average? So that's the life expectancy. But since mere survival is not considered enough, we also have to be above some thresholds, both on the objective indicators, that is sort of being out of absolute poverty and being physically and mentally not disabled. So this can be objectively measured, as well as subjective life satisfaction. So if there is this whole divide between people only believing in subjective indicators and other objective well-being indicators, so we try to marry them by requiring that a year is only counted as a year of good life if you are above a minimum threshold, both on the subjective life satisfaction as well as on the objective indicators. So that's, we are very much at the beginning of then implementing this into sustainability science.
Thank you. And the question was actually, it's similar to measures of wealth for change in economics, such as the genuine saving measures, which reflects the value of net investment in all relevant capital stocks. And if you can say something about the pros and cons of each measure, and can we expect the two approaches to give similar conclusions?
Well, there has been this recent research that really shows that actually GDP per capita and the conventional economic measures are doing a very poor job in measuring human well-being, and they're actually increasing also if you have a lot of environmental degradation, and that's what sort of led people to expand this notion to the inclusive wealth, and then there are of course many other factors, health being an important one, and also life satisfaction in a broader sense, that are parts of trying to get a holistic picture of what is progress in human well-being, which is what we want in the end. So yes, economic indicators have a role to play, but they are certainly not the only one, and even not the dominant one factor, I would think.
Thanks. Here's another question on women's education. On the fertility dimension, women's education is likely more important than men's, but what about the other types of adaptability to climate change? Can you say anything about that?
Well, for education, there's a lot of empirical research, both also on men and women's education. Of course, women's education, first, it's the desired family size declined. And if women are more empowered to pursue their own lower fertility goals, which is in developing country settings typically lower than that of the husband, because the woman has to really bear the health consequences. I mean, having frequent pregnancies under poor sanitary conditions is a problem, and also she has the burden of child rearing in many countries, almost exclusively on her. So there's often that the husbands want more children than the woman. So if the woman is better empowered to go ahead with her typically lower desired family size, that will lead to lower actual fertility, because she will also be more empowered to get access to contraception and also resist the pressures from her family or peers. And so that is, male education is not irrelevant. It's of course easier if both husband and wife agree what they want and they sort of share the same goals. But the probably female education is more influential on the reproductive behavior itself. Now, when it comes to the adaptive capacity, I think it's equally important. I mean, there are some studies, and there are many, many case studies in this field showing that it's the household making jointly decision of how to protect themselves against possible natural disasters, and it's both the husbands and the wives' education that matter there. And I don't know if any studies that in this context within the household say, like, what does differential education between husband and wife mean for the vulnerability, but it's typically the household level decisions that matter here.
Thank you. And on the last question, which is connected to this one, can you provide us more details about how education helps people going through disasters?
I mean, there has been an interesting case study by my colleague Raya Muthurak in Thailand, if I can highlight this. This was, then in 2004, there has been this disastrous tsunami that killed many people, and particularly in Thailand, the Khao Lak area was hardest hit, which is part of the Phang Nga region. And then there was some years later another tsunami warning that did not result in a real tsunami, but there was a warning. And then these colleagues went out and did a survey right after the tsunami warning. And they found an interesting thing, that for those people who had already experienced the 2004 tsunami, they knew exactly what to do, how to sort of run to higher lands and how to prepare and what to take along. But for those who had then more recently moved to the coast, and there has been, because of tourism, a lot of movement from the inland to the coastal areas, there was a very clear divide between education groups. The better educated people, although they did not themselves experience the tsunami, they knew what to do. They could imagine the counterfactual. They could imagine what a tsunami was and how they should behave. Whereas the lower education groups, who had not experienced the tsunami, they didn't know what it potentially could be. They were completely helpless and did not take the right precautions. So these abstraction skills, this thinking the counterfactual, thinking in models, something that you have not yet experienced, that is really where the abstraction skills enhanced by education make a difference. And that's also with climate change. I mean, climate change, we don't really feel it so strongly yet. We don't see the CO2, we don't smell it. It is based on relatively abstract scientific models that we have to believe. And this belief and trust in abstract models tends to be more pronounced if you also have higher abstraction skills.
Yes, thank you very much. Although I must say that even if you can't see the climate change as such, you can definitely see the effects of it in many parts of the world, also where the education is very low. So, but
if I can add, I mean, what we see in terms of droughts or weather events, the distinction whether this is now already enhanced through climate change or whether it's a natural phenomenon, this is again based on scientific models.
Well, thank you so much for all your answers to the questions. And we will now again take a break before we have a panel discussion for interdisciplinary researchers. And so we will see each other again at 5 to the hour, wherever you are. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Welcome back from the break and welcome to our panel discussion. And with me today, I have Professor Gustav Arrhenius, philosopher and director of the Institute of Future Studies. Wendy Broadgate, Global Hub Director, Sweden for Future Earth. She has a PhD in marine chemistry and has spent much of her career in global change research. Line Gordon, who is the director of Stockholm Resilience Center and professor in sustainability science. And Thomas Sterner, professor of environmental economics at Gothenburg University. Warmly welcome, all of you. And we've decided to have as a focus for this panel discussion, which population and demography issues are most important for a sustainable future, sorry. And we will start off this panel with letting our panel members introduce us briefly to their work and give us their perspective on this question. And we will give you 3 minutes each. And let's start with Wendy.
Hi, everybody. As Agneta said, I'm Global Hub Director of Future Earth in Sweden. Throughout my career, I started as an oceanographer, but I worked with the International Geosphere Biosphere Program for many years, and basically was involved in the development of the Great Accelerations, which clearly was driven by population change, but looking at other environmental and socioeconomic changes as a result of that population change at a very at a global level. Involved in the development of the Anthropocene concept, and have worked really at the intersection between different disciplines involved in global environmental change. So I'm very much a generalist. I'm currently leading the secretariat behind the Earth Commission, which is an assessment to define both a safe and a just corridor to maintain our planet within a safe and just resilient space for human development. And as a part of that, having a lot of interactions with social scientists around equity and justice, as well as natural scientists around understanding better tipping points and how we can avoid crossing those thresholds. So trying to define the safe space to underpin the setting of science-based targets for the global commons. So that's a bit about my background. But ultimately, this has been a super exciting couple of days. And I think some of my take-home messages from this community, I will try to highlight, but thinking more generally, especially from the discussions of yesterday, looking at income and standards of living and how, as they improve, we clearly need, and we know this, a huge transformation in our lifestyles to be more sustainable. And that goes way beyond the energy system, but right through to being more sustainable in our production and consumption approaches. So I see a lot of opportunity for interaction between demographers and other researchers working on these other systems in order to help both define and help stimulate that huge transformation that we need to go through. I think the rights to development and the equity issues are at the center of our challenges, and we need to address those in the social sciences, as well as connect that through to policies. I think that's one of the biggest challenges we have today. There was a recent article in Science by David Abura et al., leading a group of African scientists thinking around how our right to development can affect our ability to protect the global commons in Africa, for example, around biodiversity. So those type of issues are central. I think urbanization is a huge opportunity. And as Karen mapped out, how we develop our growing cities is really an opportunity to address some of these issues. And then finally, I think the growing youth population in Africa, I've seen some projections that show that half of the world's children will be based in Africa by 2100. But obviously, what I've heard in the last couple of days is the uncertainty around those type of projections and how society may change, particularly education may affect those projections. But I'd love to see a little bit more nuances around how that growing youth population in Africa is actually how we address that and understand that, and both the challenges and the opportunities there. So I think I'll stop there, but I think it's been super exciting so far.
Yeah, thank you so much for these reflections. And I think we'll move next to Thomas.
Thank you. I thought we said we'd go in order. I'm sorry, I was not quite on the page, but thank you. I was challenged, and we had a small chat before, and someone said that they expected me to perform as the usual economist, saying that nothing matters. And I tried to sell myself as a person who is sensible in spite of being an economist. So I don't want to do that. And I have enjoyed very much this symposium. I think we should thank the Academy for putting together these interesting days. Still, I would go halfway in one direction and say that I think that the IPAT thinking does sometimes cause quite considerable problems. I've heard quite a few people say that, sort of paraphrasing, simplifying, of course, a lot, that we really should be very thankful for the one-child policy in China. Look what a carbon footprint China has now, with like 1 billion suppose they had 2 billion people instead, they would have twice as much footprint. And I just don't think we know that at all. We don't know if Chinese GDP grew so fast because they limited population. I mean, the numbers in the IPAT equation, the variables, are very strongly interdependent. And maybe the GDP per capita went up so much because population was kept from growing fast. So one needs to be very careful with the mechanical IPAT, and nobody was being mechanical. Previous speakers, I was not a critique of anybody here, but of some people in the area. And I think that sort of in some avoiding climate impact by sort of limiting population growth as a prime instrument, that would be a massacre. And I think that certainly new technology and carbon taxes are much more potent instruments to deal with climate change. The carbon taxes and other similar instruments that complemented are needed to change the structure of our consumption and the technology of our production, and those should be the prime instruments. Still, of course, we should take every opportunity particularly when there are win-wins, and better education and health for women can enhance both welfare, climate, and social goals, and at the same time avoid excessive growth in population that is not wanted. That's obviously an absolutely great thing. So I think we need to focus the aspects you asked for sort of aspects we've been talking about that I think are most important. I think education, lifestyle, technology, and democracy. We've seen how very small flows that we've had so far in migration have rather upset our political system and our political values in many countries. And that's a very worrying sign, because the problems we face with climate and other global change, biodiversity, and all kinds of other planetary boundaries we face, they are very serious problems that would be hard to solve for sensible politicians. But lately, our political system is producing autocratic leaders that are nonsensible and don't try to solve the real problems, just try to stay in power. And that's a recipe for total disaster. It's a sort of a social tipping point of some sort.
Thank you. Thanks so much. And we will move on to Lina.
Okay, thanks a lot. So I'm Line Gordon. I'm a professor in sustainability science at Stockholm University, and also the director of Stockholm Resilience Center, also based at Stockholm University. So first of all, really big thanks. I think this has been really interesting 2 days, and I thoroughly enjoyed all the presentations. I think, to me, the presentations have highlighted what, if I can borrow the words of the former director of SRC, Johan Rockström, he sometimes says that we've in a very short time gone from a small world on a big planet to a big world on a small planet. And I think all of the presentations really showed that. And along with that, it's also been very clear how we also live on a planet where we've become increasingly teleconnected. We see more increased mobility, and we have the increased urbanization that also changes the relations and how we link both ourselves and resource use between different places on this planet. We also see the huge increased inequality globally. And being a big world on a small planet, we also have less room for sort of failure as the society, the speed of our activities are also increasing. So I think for me, the big questions is, of course, how can 10 billion people live a good life on a resilient planet where we also have that capacity to have room for different things to not work as well as we think. Some of my research has looked especially at these type of issues through the lens of food and food systems. And I think was part of the Eat Lancet Commission, for example, where we looked at, is it possible to feed 10 billion people a healthy diet within the planetary boundaries? And we showed there that it is possible, but it's only possible if we have big transformations in terms of what we eat, how it's being produced, and how much is actually being wasted out of the food that we produce. So if we can sort of shift diets, improve sustainability of production practices, and reduce food loss and waste, there are ways that we can actually have a healthy diet for 10 billion people. But how do we actually get there? And I think what I also find fascinating by this, these 2 days in the presentations, is trying to think about what are the leverage points in the system. I think in a world with more urbanizations and this growing globalization, also the changes that happens in the identity and culture of our societies, to think about how we use that also as a positive force in transformation is really interesting, as well as, of course, technological development and so on. But that's just some input from me. Thanks.
Thank you, Lina. And I forgot to mention also to the audience that it's, of course, we welcome you still to pose questions in the Q&A function. So lastly, for a short introduction, I go to Gustav.
Oh, thank you. It's been great to listening to these talks, and I think it's great that the Academy has arranged this conference on this indeed pertinent subject. So as Agneta mentioned, I'm a professor of moral and political philosophy, but also the director of the Institute for Future Studies, which is an interdisciplinary research institute with around 110 researchers. And most of my research has been on our moral and political obligations to future generations, how to value future lives in our decisions, and actually the value of population change, if it's better to have more or less people. And at the Institute, I'm running a research program, Climate Ethics and Future Generations, which is among 26 researchers from lots of disciplines, demographers, economists, and also philosophers. And also new projects, which will explain my interest in this 2 days, namely sustainable population that investigates the question that to answer the question that Agneta posed. I think one of the most important questions, and which Lynn also just mentioned, what is a sustainable global population size, taking into account adequate standards of living and sustainable rate of resource extraction? So this question, as has been mentioned in some of the talks, I think Volker mentioned this, while population policy is an all too slow solution to meet environmental problems in the next 30 years. Population policy doesn't have that quick effect. It takes a long time, and it's like an oil tanker. We can forget about it more or less when it comes to what we need to do in the next 30 years. In the long run, population size is a very important factor. At some point, we will have to balance finite land on Earth with a limit to the population size, a stabilized population. So I think that's always interesting that in the public debate, there are some people think that population is everything, saying we have to do that. I think they're wrong. And then there's some people say, no, population is nothing. We can just decouple completely. I think the truth is actually, it depends on what time scale you're looking at. In a 30-year perspective, population, we can't do much about it, but in the long term, we will have to. And this leads to a situation which is, I think, extra hard, because that means that we have to get policymakers and people to consider long-term mitigation strategies that are decisive in a longer time horizon, like 50 years or more. And this is usually a very hard thing in democracies or in general, but in democracies have problems with being future-oriented in that way. They usually focus on more short-term effects, of course, politicians have to be re-elected. So that, I think, is a very, very hard question. And then, given that we have to, as I think, then have to pursue some kind of stabilization of the population size in the long term, what are the feasible and ethical adequate ways of achieving this? I'm just assuming, of course, that we are excluding, Thomas called it genocide, but also like involuntary sterilization. It has to be done in some ethically acceptable way. And that, of course, raises the question of how there's been quite a lot of focus in the past and naturally on low income countries, but now 90% live in middle income or high income countries. And most of this climate destruction come from high income countries, which are democracies. So you have to get the population on board to do these things. And I think that is a very hard question too. And then lastly, given that Thomas is here and I was the one teasing him a little bit in the beginning, I think it's important to consider how the relationship between population size, resources, and general well-being, the three things I think are very important, how they are affected by technological developments and changed economic practices. That is decoupling or green growth. I think we need to know much more about that. I don't think it will solve everything and population will be relevant, but it will have a very important effect. So I would like to know more about that. I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gustav, for your views. I was going to invite you in the panel to comment on each other's points that you've lifted. And I see Thomas already had raised his hand, so I let him start.
Thank you. Well, I thought you might do that. So, where this was, I like Gustav. I like that a lot. The long run, short run distinction you made there. In the long run, it has a lot of intellectual appeal. In the long run, population will be the ultimate variable to decide whether we can live sustainably on the one planet that I think we should stick to. If some people have other opinions. There is, of course, one inconvenience, and that is that it's not going to be climate change. Maybe that would be our main problem. It's not going to be today's technologies, nor today's constraints. Hopefully, we'll solve those in the next 100 years. Otherwise, our population size will be reduced a lot involuntarily. If we do solve them, there will be new problems, but also new technologies, and it is really a difficult problem to try to imagine what the restraints would be with those new technologies and how much population size. I mean, just coming up with a number, something would be really very difficult. Depends very strongly on technology.
Thank you.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, I simplified by just talking about climate change. Of course, there are also all the other environmental problems, biodiversity and similar things. But I would say the same for that in the 30-year perspective, we're not going to be able to do so much about population because population policy takes too long time to have effect. And there are already so many young people around. So it's long term.
At this level of abstraction, climate change is one of the easiest problems. It's caused by a couple of gases, and we know the technologies to make energy with other means. Biodiversity, chemicals, diseases. There's a lot of other things that are much more difficult.
Thanks. I think I'll stop you there and let Wendy come in with her comment or question.
Yeah, well, I think I wanted to build a little bit on Lena's point about leverage points and using changes in societies as positive forces of change, and linking a little bit to Gustav's point about the society needs to be on board with changing policies. The Global Commons Alliance recently did a survey of opinions in G20 countries and in Sweden, and it actually showed that a very large percentage of the populations in these, the biggest economies of the world, are actually well aware of some of our big challenges in the Earth system, the risks of crossing tipping points, the risks that we're taking with our our life support system. And in that survey, there was also a large percentage of the respondents that said they were willing, they were aware of how big the transformation is needed and were willing to change. Both younger people and women were more in the awareness and the willingness to change. But those kind of statistics, I think, are useful factors in thinking about how rapidly we may be able to transform, and how, you know, some of these tipping points in the social systems may be closer than we think. So I think that gives us scope for optimism, and sometimes the speed of the research in this area can't keep up with the changes in society. So I strongly agree with Lena about trying to identify these leverage points and really make them as forces for positive change.
Do you think that maybe the politicians are lagging behind their own populations in this area, in their willingness to actually take action?
Yeah, I think so, and certainly in their awareness of their citizens' kind of willingness. But I think there was also that survey also showed that the awareness of how big transformation we need was much more focused on the energy transition and less on the other big transformations that we need to do in our consumption and production and our general lifestyles, our diets and so on. So there is further to go in some areas than others.
And of course, those might be felt to be more personal as well and more difficult to have to change. I don't know if Lena, do you want to comment on any of the other points?
Maybe, or I can maybe pick up on a comment. Also, I see some comments in the chat. So I was thinking, and I see are some of the other panelists discussing what is a good sort of long-term and short-term goal. That sometimes was a politician, Eric Lambani, saying here in a comment that a politician talked about the long-term perspective being sort of 2 or 3 months. And I think something that's also interesting and fascinating, and that I hear more and more also discussing the type of transitions that we need to go through with both CEOs of big companies and as well as other just citizens, is I think the whole what's called Friday for the Future movement and the youth movement have really put kind of the future generations even more presently in our thinking. And I mean, we live here on this planet for such a short time of the history of this planet. If we're lucky, we're here for 100 years or something. And I think we more and more start thinking about what is the world that we're going to hand off to our children. And I think this has started to emerge more and more in the discussions, that we're thinking about how can we make a positive imprint on this planet for the next generation. And I think that is just so important, that type of perspective starts coming up. And of course, it's not trickling down into policy and so on yet, but I hope that, I feel like the more and more people are starting to see that perspective, at least. So that's a side comment, but I thought it was an important one to me. Thanks.
Thank you, Lena. Gustav, you wanted to comment on Wendy's?
Yes, so I want to pick up on Wendy, but also what Lena said, and I thought that's very interesting. I really need to get my hands on that study. Another positive thing is we did a study at the Institute. I mean, usually earlier people seem reluctant to sacrifice for future generations, but we succeeded in disaggregating 2 different things, whether people are willing to sacrifice future generations and whether they trusted the government to do it. So if you have a tax, for example, that would be used for making it better for future generations. And when we succeeded to disaggregate this, it showed that people are willing to sacrifice for the future quite a lot. They just don't trust government to use the money in the right way. So it's rather a trust question rather than that. So that's on the positive side. Then, unfortunately, there are studies pointing in other directions. If you look what people, when they vote in elections, for example, in Europe, climate and environment comes like 8th place. So given how important this issue is, there's still a big problem so to say, with the voters. They don't put it out when they choose which party to vote for, and that's a very important thing. So there we have a problem.
Thanks, yeah. And I was thinking what you said earlier, Gustav, on your new project. So what is a sustainable population size? And in the long run, what are the methods to achieve that? And I was thinking back to what Wolfgang Lutz emphasized about education. And well, if you listen to him very superficially, perhaps, then you could say that investing huge amount of money to educate people in sub-Saharan Africa would go a long way to get down the population size.
Could I jump in on that quickly, and maybe we can get Wolfgang in? I mean, as I also said, I think there's all too much focus on low-income countries. The really thing what's happening is that 90% already live in middle-income or high-income countries, and where we really have the effect, what we need to is where we have to do it is in the middle-income and high-income countries.
On the other hand, that's where the population size is projected to go down rather than rise in the decades to come. I would like to ask you.
Sorry, Agneta, couldn't we let Wolfgang in? I see he's raised his hand. I'm sorry. I mean, that would be so nice to get him in.
Okay. Yes, quickly, Wolfgang. I don't know if we're opening up.
Thank you. I'm just saying that these educational differentials, particularly with respect to life expectancy, they exist across all countries. Even in Europe, we have 7 to 8 years of difference between the lower education groups and higher education group. In Eastern Europe, Russia, they're up to 12 years. So this is there's really major differences, and this is not so much the different income or other socioeconomic factors, but it's the cognitive way how you look after your health, particularly lifestyle-related factors. But we don't have time to discuss this in detail. But also for fertility. For fertility, we have, for instance, in Sweden and some of the highly developed countries, a much more narrow education fertility differential. But there still are some differentials. But in mortality, it's very visible.
Thank you, Wolfgang. I'm going to change a little bit the perspective now. Well, from your research front, are there something in particular that might strongly influence population and migration in the future that you haven't seen included in projections or heard mentioned in presentation? And a little bit vice versa, is it something from your perspectives that you think the demographers should put more attention to in their research to help achieve a sustainable transition in many areas? A broad question, I know, but anyone?
Well, maybe the link between education, migration, education, population migration, and democracy. I think not just democracy, but even more broadly, quality of governance. It's really I think a striking problem that it's hard to rank all the big crises we have. We like enumerating them, like climate and biodiversity and so on. But I think the crisis of politics and governance is really striking. We have an unusually uncanny sort of pantheon of political leaders across the world. Now, one of the worst just recently left, but we don't know how temporary that is. So it's really quite striking. And I think there are connections. I haven't done research on that, but I think there are connections with education, population growth, migration, education.
Right. Anyone else want to comment? Okay, so I'll go on to another question. Is it possible to achieve a just and sustainable population and climate transition? Any thoughts on that?
Could I jump in here, or anyone else?
Yeah, why not?
Clearly it's possible, but whether we will succeed or not is another question. I mean, I think it connects to a little bit of what Thomas just said. I mean, what we need is to develop institutions that will handle this in an appropriate way, and these institutions need to maybe not global, but they have to be involving, they have to be supranational because we can't handle this problem otherwise. And that's where we have to go. And whether that will happen or not, is unsure. But if you look historically, it's amazing what human beings can do when it really becomes a crisis. The ingenuity and when it really comes about, we can do a lot. So I'm an optimist that we will be able to do it in one way or other.
Wendy.
I love your optimism, Gustav. I hope that we can do it too, but I see some enormous challenges on the way, and I think two of those are the increasing inequalities we have in the world, both within country and between countries, that I think is a challenge that we're not addressing adequately today. And the other enormous challenge is the areas of the world fit for human habitation if we continue with our climate change as business as usual. In the discussion after Laurie's talk, someone talked about the Chou et al. Paper, looking at the, it is a business as usual scenario if we're not addressing our emissions, and we could have a third of the population of the world in completely uninhabitable temperatures in 70 years, 50 years from now. We actually have to address climate change really urgently to avoid that. But if somewhere towards that scale of uninhabitable parts of the planet where we're currently living today actually happens, we have extreme conflict and huge challenges on the table. So we've got kind of communication challenges about how big this transformation is that we need is huge behavioral change and cultural changes. But yeah, humans, we have a capacity to change, which is really huge, and transformations can happen really quickly. But yeah, the challenges are very, very large.
Gustav.
Yeah, I of course agree with the problems that Wendy raises. Here's another way of looking at it. I hope that it can give some optimism. So, of course, we wonder this is going to cost a lot of money, how to do this. But if you look at how much internationally we spend on the military, what states spend on the military, that's around, in 2016, was around $141 billion. Whereas it's it's like 8.5% what we spend on climate to fight climate change, 8.5% of what we spend on defense. So there is a lot of money around if you just get it the right way. So the resources are there, we just need to use them right.
Lina.
Yeah, I also just both share the optimism that is possible and the concern how problematic it is, and also that so much of the change that will need to happen will also be in one part of the population, while most of the effect is going to be on other places in the world, and that is very unequal, and the type of tensions arising around that is also something of concern, I think. But of course, I think it is possible, and I can't see another way forward than we have to find the solution and make it work.
Thomas.
Yeah, well, whether or not it's possible, we should definitely try either way. And in fact, as far as we can judge, I think today, and speaking perhaps more narrowly of just of climate, it's actually quite a discrepancy. It's actually a relatively simple problem to provide non-fossil fuel for a good living standard. That is solvable. It's also solvable to increase efficiency in energy use a lot. But it's very frustrating to see how difficult it is to get any sensible forms in the right direction through real life parliaments, like getting just a gas tax or a carbon tax through the US Senate, or getting virtually anything sensible through the US Senate seems sort of impossible.
And then, yes, and also it is true that we get the politicians that we say.
Well, we get the politicians that the oil industry pays for.
Yeah. Well,
So-
for them. I wanted to come back to, well, I wanted to continue this, but this notion of the concern for coming populations. But what are the chances that policymakers and voters will take into account the life of future generations when they largely fail to take into account the well-being of people living now in poorer parts of the world? And related to that, I was thinking about the picture often painted of earlier generations as farmers or in other sectors that have this perspective that future generations are planting trees that will grow into the future and generate incomes for their grandchildren or grandchildren. Is this picture true? And how can we in that case promote this philosophy today? I think maybe Gustav can start answering that question.
Yeah, I'm not sure I got the question completely, but it's the question about whether the perspective of, you can see in the past, people care more about future generations and now less, or something like that.
Yes.
I think
Well, it seems to, and then yes, and how can we make people think more about future generations when it's difficult even to take in consideration the poor people of today?
I think the major change is that we now have in our hands technology and ways of affecting future generations much further into the future. That wasn't really the case. Sometimes it could be, but not really the case if you go 300 years back. Now, I think this awareness really came to fruition with the debate about the nuclear power, and we realized that what we do now have this effect far into the future. So and it takes some time to realize that. But there were thinkers already way back. If you look at, for example, Edmund Burke in the 18th century was thinking about this more, thought that we only have the planet, we only take care of the planets for future generations. So there are already people been thinking like that earlier. Now, this about the, so to say, consciousness raising, I think that is just extremely ongoing activity now, but maybe not enough given people's voting pattern. In the end, it's people who have to demand things from the political parties, otherwise they won't change. And that to, so to say, vote more, put environmental issue and climate change higher up when they decide to vote, rather than the rather more short-term issues. How to achieve that? I'm afraid I don't have an answer to that. That should be something we should ask a political psychologist about. But clearly, it's not going to happen without people getting involved. So, of course, we have all these different action groups, and I think they're doing a fantastic job. And Greta Thunberg is just one example. Things like that will in the end have an effect.
Wendy, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, well, I was just a bit of a reflection on often seeing the issues we're tackling as sort of externalities removed from our lives today. You know, the environment and climate is slightly removed from us as people, and actually framing the debate more about our well-being, our future of our children, and you know, our own quality of life. I think maybe a framing that resonates more with people than sort of environment and climate. But I think it is a huge challenge, and I do think that the Fridays for Future movement is really raising up the profile of future generations right on the table of politicians, and also, you know, us oldies, that, you know, it's what we're doing for our children, the decisions we're making that affect our children and our grandchildren are super important. And I think that movement has momentum and is really beginning to show an impact.
Thank you. Thomas?
Yes, I think I like the way you pose this question, Agneta, sort of question of custody at the center of your question. And I think in traditional societies, I don't mean necessarily exotic ones, but also Swedish countryside, for instance, where people have grown up in a village where kind of the stability of the neighbors and property has been a feature of life, that people have this feeling that not just that the world belongs to them, but that they belong to the world, they belong to their village, and they are the custodians of a particular piece of territory, farm or whatever, for a while, and then hand it over to their children. I think, but this is just amateurish reflection, I think it's more difficult to have that feeling of custody in a rootless world where you live in not only big cities, but you move between big cities all the time, and you don't actually have a particular place or a particular group of relatives to relate to, and so on. So I think so there'll be a bad feedback from in a way, in that feeling of custody disappears with the modern lifestyle.
Yes. Lina, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, and I think it's a really interesting discussion. And I think just to directly on your point, Thomas, I think maybe we need to cultivate a new type of identity in the absence of that strong local place that we really have to think of ourselves and our future generation as custodians of the biosphere, and we're citizens of the biosphere. And so instead rather of a certain place, this is our place. And on a small planet and being a big world, maybe that resonates with that. And I think several of my colleagues have been working on a project called The Seeds of a Good Anthropocene. And I really, what they wanted to do in that project is really to also reframe some of these discussions about the future. There is so much about the imagining the future that so far has been about catastrophe and darkness and risks, etc. But what if we start putting kind of at the center of these discussions and what are seeds that exist today, but that can be flowering in the future and actually help build a positive story of a positive Anthropocene in which people can thrive, and what takes us there then. I think about that sometimes also work on food system change. There's so much of the discussions that has to do with what we have to shift away from and what we cannot eat in order to sort of reduce our resource use. So don't eat meat, or don't eat processed flour, or don't eat salt and sugar, etc. But if you think about it, today, I think we eat around 150 different species globally, but there are 300,000 species that's potentially edible. And I think it's like 4 species that constitute the majority of the calories that we eat: rice, wheat, maize, etc. But why don't we talk more about what we can eat? What are the new flavors that we can put on the plate? And how do we get them there and envision a positive story around that? So I think we need that sort of to get the change in identity, in culture, and becoming stewards of this biosphere. We need to also bring that positive story with us.
Thank you. And this is really a positive way to end this, but I'm going to fall in the trap of the moderator and extend the time a little bit. And because I would like to bring us back again to the issue of population and demography, and ask all of you, but this has to be really, really short. Could you mention 2 leverage points, or 1, just to make it even shorter, for change that you believe can make a significant difference toward a sustainable future for the growing population on Earth?
Should I start? Or?
Yeah, You start.
Actually, your question, then I can say what I also want to say in response to Lina, but your earlier question. I think we should think more about finding, so say, good climate and environmental ideas in different ideologies and religions. We usually don't like speaking about this as scientists, but most people are very religious. Religion can have ideas that are bad for the environment. They can also have ideas that are good for the environment, and we should help them develop this idea. Likewise, you need to find good ways of thinking about the environment from different ideological perspectives. So ideas taken, you can find ideas in conservatives, in liberalism, in socialism, that talks towards a better way of dealing with the environment. Just to take one example, I mean, there's no necessity that the Republicans in United States should be climate change deniers. They used to be on the forefront. In the late 80s, they were on the forefront because they saw climate change as a national threat. Similar to Soviet Union, they were talking about, okay, now when Soviet Union is disappearing, we have a new national threat, and that is climate change. So I think we should think more, and that is a kind of leverage point, how to formulate green visions for different ideologies and for different religions. That would be, I think, one way to getting ahead quicker.
Great, thank you so much. Who wants to go next? Thomas?
Well, and the first thing that came to my mind is that the organization I worked a lot with in the United States, the Environmental Defense Fund, they tried to do that. They've actually invested very large sums of money, since they have quite a lot of money, in finding a single Republican or two who can read and write and actually sort of, have a conversation about the environment, trying to foster a small group of Republicans who think on the subject. I hate to tell you that the project is not hasn't had an outstanding success yet. but
it was the same problem with tobacco in the beginning, but look now.
Yeah. I also had a comment before on what Lina said. I mean, I think we need to do more work. We started, some of your friends and some of mine, quite a big group writing about policy making in the Anthropocene. And I think we need to, I thought of that paper as just opening up a field, really. We need to think, it's a big field, of course, and it's easy to sort of point to one or two things that the character of the policy making will depend on how close you are to various thresholds. Or
Thank you.
No.
Wendy, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I think it's a big question. It's a big question. It's hard to answer. My list is long, but I think I will settle on addressing inequalities as one of the leverage points. And one aspect of solutions there, I think, is to move away from our traditional economic measures of progress to more holistic measures of progress, such as well-being, and I think that can be one of the leverage points. And I also think the positive visions approach, we have lots and lots of solutions and pathways that we've mapped out in the science world, and I think we can embed and inspire by developing those with citizens, and therefore helping, as Lina mapped said, helping people see positive visions that are possible, and therefore work our way there as a global community.
Wonderful, thank you. Lina?
Yeah, I think two leverage things are, we need to have the energy transition, and we need a transition in food systems. Those are two kind of key to resolve those resource scarcity and a lot of the global environmental issues that we have. And I think I agree with also what has been said, what Gustav and Thomas and Wendy said, and about creating changes in positive visions and in order to sort of get there as well as new technologies, etc. But yeah, thanks.
Well, thank you so much to the panel, and now we're come to an end of these 2 days of discussions around population and environmental change. And I would also like to thank again all speakers that have taken part, and the organizers, of course, at the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences and the Bayer Institute. And thank you very much also to the Crafoord Foundation for its funding. And I would like to remind you all, sorry, that these 2 days of the symposium has been recorded, so you can enjoy it over and over again, or spread the word to people who might be interested in these subjects. And thank you so much. I have thoroughly enjoyed it, and I hope you have too. Thank you.